Sometimes life doesn't give someone an answer directly. Instead, it creates one unexpected moment that makes the answer impossible to avoid. And your soulmate may have just experienced a moment like that. They weren't searching for clarity. They weren't planning to revisit the past. They were simply going through an ordinary day when a completely unexpected encounter placed them in a situation they could never have prepared for. For a brief moment, something about that encounter felt strangely familiar, and before they could control their reaction, a thought connected everything back to you. They may have tried to stay composed, but internally something shifted. A truth they had carefully kept at a distance suddenly felt much closer. For a long time, they may have convinced themselves that certain feelings were simply part of the past, something they had already understood and moved beyond. But this encounter challenged that belief. It made them question why certain memories still carried emotional weight, why your presence could still enter their thoughts so unexpectedly, and why they had spent so much energy avoiding certain questions. What happened next wasn't necessarily dramatic from the outside, but inside them, a realization began taking shape. And the most surprising part is this: the encounter didn't create the truth they were facing. It simply removed the distractions that had been helping them avoid it. For a long time, your soulmate may have carried a very simple explanation for everything that happened between you. They may have told themselves that it was only a chapter that had reached its natural ending, that circumstances were responsible for the distance, or that whatever emotions once existed had simply faded with time. That explanation may have been comfortable because it allowed them to continue without examining anything too deeply. They could remember you occasionally without asking why the memory still mattered. They could think about certain moments without questioning what those moments meant. They could move forward with their life while keeping one part of the story carefully untouched. But the truth they had been avoiding was not necessarily about whether they could live without you. Of course, they could continue living, working, meeting people, making plans, and experiencing new things. The deeper question was whether they had ever truly understood what the connection meant to them. And that was the question they kept postponing. Whenever a memory became too emotional, they could distract themselves. Whenever they felt the urge to look back, they could tell themselves there was no point. Whenever they wondered what might have happened if they had been more honest, they could remind themselves that the past could not be changed. Eventually, these explanations became almost automatic. They weren't necessarily lying to anyone else. They were trying to make the situation easier for themselves. Because admitting that someone still holds emotional significance can make a person vulnerable. It means accepting that there are feelings you cannot completely control and questions you cannot answer with logic alone. Your soulmate may have preferred certainty, so they chose the explanation that gave them the most control. They told themselves they had moved on because saying anything else would require them to look at the parts of their story they weren't ready to face. But then the chance encounter happened. Suddenly, that carefully constructed explanation began to feel incomplete. Something about the moment made them notice their own reaction. Maybe it was the way their heart responded before their mind could catch up. Maybe it was the sudden memory that appeared. Maybe it was the realization that they were still affected by something they thought they had already released. Whatever the trigger was, they could no longer simply brush it aside. They may have gone back to their normal routine afterward, but the encounter followed them mentally. They started replaying it, wondering why it had affected them so much. They may have asked themselves whether they were simply nostalgic or whether there was something deeper underneath the reaction. And that is where the internal conflict becomes important. Nostalgia is easy to understand. It is a natural response to meaningful memories. But when a single unexpected moment makes someone question years of emotional assumptions, it can reveal that there is more to explore. Your soulmate may have started remembering the details they usually avoided. They may have thought about conversations that ended too quickly, opportunities that never developed, or moments when they wanted to say something but decided against it. Perhaps there were times when they felt closer to you than they allowed themselves to admit. Perhaps there were moments when your presence made them feel understood, but instead of embracing that feeling, they became cautious. They may now realize that their distance wasn't always proof that they didn't care. Sometimes distance is created because someone cares and doesn't know what to do with that feeling. Fear can make people withdraw. Pride can make them remain silent. Uncertainty can make them wait until the moment has passed. And once enough time passes, people can convince themselves that their hesitation was actually certainty. Your soulmate may now be questioning whether that happened to them. They may be looking back and realizing that some of their strongest decisions were made while they were afraid. That doesn't mean every choice was wrong. It simply means they are finally willing to examine the reasons behind those choices. They may also be recognizing that they misunderstood what they needed from the connection. Perhaps they thought they needed distance when what they really needed was clarity. Perhaps they believed avoiding the subject would create peace when what they actually needed was an honest conversation. Perhaps they thought time would answer everything automatically, only to discover that time sometimes creates perspective but doesn't create closure by itself. This realization can feel uncomfortable because it forces them to take responsibility for their emotional life. They can no longer blame timing for everything or assume circumstances made every decision for them. They have to acknowledge their own fears, choices, and silences. And that may be the truth the chance encounter exposed. The problem was never simply that the connection ended or changed. The problem was that part of them never fully understood why they let it become what it became. Now that question is standing directly in front of them. They may not have the final answer yet, but they are finally asking the right question. And sometimes that is where genuine emotional change begins. Not with a dramatic declaration, not with an immediate reunion, but with the quiet realization that the story you told yourself no longer explains what your heart is experiencing. The encounter has given your soulmate a reason to look again, and this time they may be looking without the same defenses they had before. And once that chance encounter was over, something inside your soulmate may have continued unfolding long after the moment itself had passed. What seemed insignificant from the outside may have become impossible for them to stop thinking about. They could return to their normal routine, continue their responsibilities, speak to other people, and act as though nothing unusual had happened. But their mind kept circling back to the same realization. It wasn't necessarily the encounter itself that mattered most. It was what the encounter revealed. Suddenly, memories they had carefully placed in the background began appearing with surprising clarity. They remembered things they hadn't consciously thought about in a long time, not because they were trying to live in the past, but because their mind was connecting pieces that had never fully made sense before. A simple detail could remind them of a conversation. That conversation could remind them of a feeling. That feeling could lead them to another moment with you. Before they realized it, one unexpected encounter had opened an entire emotional chain reaction. And this time, they weren't simply remembering what happened. They were remembering how they felt when it happened. That distinction may have surprised them more than anything else. They could explain away an old photograph or a familiar place. They could tell themselves that memories naturally return from time to time. But explaining why their hearts still responded to those memories was much harder. They may have started thinking about the way you made them feel seen, understood, challenged, or accepted. Perhaps there were moments when they felt comfortable enough to reveal parts of themselves they normally kept hidden. Perhaps you noticed things they didn't know how to explain. Maybe you offered a kind of emotional presence they didn't fully appreciate until much later. These details can become powerful when viewed through the perspective of time. What once seemed ordinary can suddenly become meaningful. A conversation that felt casual at the time may now feel like something they wish they had understood better. A moment they dismissed may now appear like a missed opportunity to communicate honestly. And as these memories returned, your soulmate may have started recognizing something uncomfortable. They had spent a long time focusing on how the connection ended or changed without fully appreciating what the connection had given them. That realization can change the entire emotional story. Instead of asking, "Why did this happen?" they may begin asking, "What did this mean to me?" Instead of blaming circumstances, they may begin examining their own behavior. Instead of trying to prove that they had moved on, they may finally allow themselves to acknowledge that you left an impact. And that impact doesn't necessarily mean they are destined to return, or that the future has already been decided. It means the connection mattered enough to teach them something. Perhaps it taught them that emotional closeness requires courage. Perhaps it showed them that avoiding difficult conversations can create deeper wounds than honesty ever would. Maybe it taught them that people cannot be expected to understand feelings that are never expressed. Or perhaps it revealed qualities they now value more deeply in relationships. Your soulmate may even be realizing that they were not emotionally prepared for the kind of connection they experienced with you. At the time, they may have wanted simplicity, control, or certainty. But genuine emotional connections rarely provide all three. They require vulnerability. They require communication. They require the willingness to admit when something matters. If they weren't ready for that before, they may now understand why they reacted the way they did. This can bring a mixture of emotions. There may be regret, but also gratitude. There may be sadness, but also acceptance. There may be curiosity about what could have happened, but also respect for the path both of you have taken. And perhaps the most important shift is that they are no longer trying to erase the memory. They are trying to understand it. That is a completely different emotional position. When someone tries to erase a memory, they usually focus on avoiding the feeling. When they begin understanding the memory, they become curious about what the feeling is trying to teach them. Your soulmate may be entering that second stage now. They may be looking at their past with more compassion, recognizing that the person they were then didn't have the awareness they have today. They may forgive themselves for hesitating. They may understand why they became distant. They may acknowledge that fear influenced certain choices. And they may also recognize that you had your own emotions, boundaries, and perspective that they couldn't fully know at the time. This realization can make the entire connection feel different. Instead of seeing it as a simple story of what happened and what didn't happen, they begin seeing it as an experience that shaped them. And that is why the chance encounter feels so significant. It didn't necessarily hand them an answer. It gave them the courage to start asking better questions. Why did you matter so much? Why did certain memories survive? Why did they avoid certain feelings? Why did they become so uncomfortable whenever the subject came close to their heart? And perhaps the question that stays with them the longest is the simplest one. If they truly felt nothing anymore, why did that unexpected encounter affect them at all? They may not be ready to answer that question immediately, but now they are willing to sit with it. And once someone stops running from a question, the answer often becomes much easier to hear. What began as a chance encounter has now become a moment of self-reflection, and your soulmate may be realizing that the truth they avoided wasn't hidden somewhere outside of them. It was quietly waiting inside them all along. What happens next inside your soulmate is quieter than a dramatic confession, but it may be far more important because they are beginning to look at their own choices with a level of honesty they didn't have before. The chance encounter has already disrupted the explanation they used to protect themselves, and now they are asking questions they once avoided. They may be thinking about the moments when they chose silence instead of vulnerability, distance instead of communication, and certainty instead of taking an emotional risk. For a long time, they may have believed those choices were simply the result of circumstances, but now they are starting to wonder whether fear played a larger role than they wanted to admit. Perhaps they were afraid of being rejected. Perhaps they didn't know whether you felt the same way. Perhaps they were protecting themselves after previous disappointments. Or perhaps they simply weren't emotionally ready to understand how meaningful the connection had become. Whatever the reason, they can now see that avoiding their feelings didn't necessarily make those feelings disappear. It only made them harder to understand. And this realization can bring a strange combination of regret and peace. Regret because they may remember opportunities they didn't take, conversations they didn't have, and moments when they could have been more honest. Peace because they finally understand why those memories continued to return. There was something unresolved beneath them. Your soulmate may even begin imagining what they would say if they could revisit certain moments. Not necessarily to rewrite the past, but to understand it from the perspective they have today. Maybe they would communicate more openly. Maybe they would ask questions instead of making assumptions. Maybe they would admit when they were afraid instead of pretending to be unaffected. Maybe they would appreciate the connection while it was happening, instead of realizing its importance only after distance had created perspective. These thoughts can be difficult because they force a person to acknowledge their own part in the story. But they can also become the beginning of emotional maturity. Your soulmate may be learning that love, connection, and meaningful relationships cannot always be handled through control. Sometimes you have to be willing to be seen. You have to admit when someone matters. You have to communicate, even when you don't know how the conversation will end. And perhaps this is what the chance encounter revealed most clearly. They weren't only avoiding a person or a memory. They were avoiding vulnerability. They were avoiding the possibility of discovering that they cared more deeply than they wanted to. That possibility can feel frightening because once someone admits that another person matters, they also have to accept that the person has the ability to affect them. They can disappoint them. They can leave. They can say no. They can move on. For someone who values emotional control, that can feel incredibly uncomfortable. Your soulmate may now understand that protecting themselves from emotional pain also prevented them from experiencing emotional honesty. And as they think about you, they may begin recognizing qualities they once underestimated. Perhaps they now appreciate the patience you showed. Perhaps they understand why certain questions mattered to you. Maybe they realize that what they once saw as emotional intensity was actually your desire for clarity and genuine connection. Maybe they remember how consistently you showed care in small ways that seemed ordinary at the time. Distance has a strange way of changing perspective. When someone is close to us, we can become accustomed to their presence and stop noticing the details that make them special. When they are no longer part of our everyday life, those details can become surprisingly clear. Your soulmate may be experiencing that now. They may be remembering not just what you did, but the kind of person you were while doing it. And that can make them question whether they ever truly appreciated you in the way they should have. Still, this doesn't mean they suddenly know exactly what they want. They may have uncertainty about the future. They may wonder whether reaching out would be appropriate, whether enough time has passed, or whether you have already moved into a completely different chapter. They may also understand that your life doesn't stop simply because they have reached a new realization. That awareness can make their emotions more serious. They may recognize that if they ever speak again, it cannot simply be because they are feeling nostalgic. It would need to come from honesty, respect, and genuine intention. And perhaps that is why they are taking their time. The chance encounter opened the door, but they still have to decide what they are willing to do with what they discovered. For now, the most important change is internal. They are no longer trying to convince themselves that the connection was meaningless. They are no longer automatically dismissing every memory. They are beginning to accept that something about the experience mattered deeply enough to shape them. And when a person reaches that level of honesty, they often begin to see their past differently. They stop asking who was right and who was wrong. They start asking what they learned, what they would change, and what they genuinely value now. Your soulmate may be standing at exactly that point. The chance encounter didn't force them toward a specific future. It simply removed one of the biggest barriers between them and their own truth. They can now see that the emotional chapter they tried to close still contains lessons they never fully understood. And perhaps the most powerful realization is that they don't need to know what happens next in order to be honest about what happened before. They can acknowledge that you mattered. They can acknowledge that they were affected. They can acknowledge that fear influenced them. They can acknowledge that some things were left unsaid. And from there, whatever comes next can be approached with a clearer heart rather than the same confusion that once kept them running. And now, after everything this unexpected encounter brought back to the surface, your soulmate may finally be reaching the quietest but most important part of this realization. They can no longer pretend that the past meant nothing to them. They may still have questions about what happens next, and they may not know whether life will ever create another opportunity for the two of you, but something inside them has changed. Before this moment, they could easily tell themselves that they had moved on because they had learned how to keep the memories at a distance. Now they understand that moving forward and understanding the past are not the same thing. They can continue living their life while still acknowledging that someone once had a meaningful impact on them. They can accept that the connection changed them without needing to immediately define what that means for the future. And perhaps this is the truth they had been avoiding for so long. It wasn't necessarily that they were supposed to return to the past. It was that they had never been completely honest about what the past meant to them. The chance encounter gave them a mirror, and in that mirror they saw emotions, choices, fears, and memories they had spent a long time avoiding. They saw the moments when they held back. They saw the opportunities they didn't recognize. They saw the conversations they never had. They saw the parts of themselves that weren't ready to be vulnerable. And they may finally understand that those experiences weren't meaningless. They became part of who they are today. Perhaps they are even grateful for the lesson because it has shown them what they value now. Maybe they understand that emotional honesty matters more than appearing unaffected. Maybe they have learned that silence isn't always strength. Sometimes silence is simply fear wearing a calm expression. Maybe they have learned that waiting for perfect certainty can cause people to miss moments that can never be recreated. And maybe they have learned that when someone genuinely matters, it is worth communicating rather than assuming. These are lessons your soulmate may carry forward, regardless of what happens between you. But there is something important for you to remember as you listen to this. You don't have to chase this realization for them. You don't have to force an encounter, search for hidden signs, or put your own life on hold, waiting for someone else to become ready. If your soulmate has truly reached a deeper understanding, their actions will eventually speak for themselves. Real clarity doesn't need to be forced. Real intention becomes visible through consistency, communication, respect, and effort. Your role is not to convince someone of your value. Your value existed before they recognized it, and it remains regardless of what they choose to do next. So if this story resonates with you, let it remind you of something equally important. Sometimes another person's realization is not the final chapter of your story. Sometimes it simply confirms how much you have grown since the chapter began. You may have once wondered why someone didn't understand you, why they hesitated, why they remained silent, or why the connection unfolded differently than you hoped. But perhaps you are now learning to release the need for every question to have an immediate answer. Some answers arrive through time, some arrive through distance, some arrive when people finally have enough perspective to understand what they couldn't see before. And your soulmate may be experiencing that perspective now. The chance encounter didn't necessarily predict a specific outcome. It simply interrupted their old way of thinking. It reminded them that certain feelings cannot always be explained away as coincidence. It made them look at a chapter they thought they had finished and recognize that there were still lessons waiting inside it. Maybe they now understand that you were more important than they admitted. Maybe they recognize that their fear prevented them from being fully honest. Maybe they realize that the connection revealed parts of themselves they had never examined before. And perhaps they finally understand why your memory remained so difficult to dismiss. Not because they were incapable of moving forward, but because meaningful experiences don't always disappear when circumstances change. Some connections become part of our emotional history. They teach us, they challenge us, they reveal us to ourselves. And years later, something unexpected can bring that lesson back into focus. That may be what this encounter has done for your soulmate. It has not necessarily answered every question, but it has made one thing clearer. They cannot keep pretending that the connection had no impact. They can no longer hide behind the same explanations. They can no longer tell themselves that every memory is meaningless. They can no longer ignore the fact that something about you changed the way they understood themselves and what they wanted from emotional connection. What they do with that realization belongs to them. Perhaps one day it leads to an honest conversation. Perhaps it leads to closure. Perhaps it simply helps them become more emotionally courageous in the relationships they build from this point forward. The future is still unwritten, and that uncertainty is okay. What matters is that the truth has finally been acknowledged, and sometimes that is the beginning of real transformation. A chance encounter can last only a few minutes, but the realization it creates can stay with someone for years. Your soulmate may have walked away from that moment expecting life to continue exactly as before, only to discover that something inside them had shifted. They were face to face with a truth they had spent far too long avoiding. And now they have a choice, not necessarily about whether to return, but about whether they will continue hiding from themselves or finally live with greater honesty. Perhaps that is the real meaning of this entire experience. The encounter didn't decide your future. It revealed their truth. And from here, let actions, time, mutual effort, and genuine communication tell you what words or assumptions never could.